For my second project, I decided to do a motor control theories, research, and application. The title of the first paper was labeled Interaction between Voluntary Contraction and Tonic Stretch Reflex Transmission in Normal and Spastic Patients. The purpose of the study was to measure the characteristics of the biceps brachii muscle in spastic and normal patients, sustaining different levels of voluntary contraction, and this was to conclude that the supraspinal control of reflex transmission should be impaired in spastic patients. Tasks. There were two groups, 10 subjects. One had no history of neurological disturbances, while the other had cerebral palsy, and they presented with spasticity. The subject was to sit in a supine position with constrained movement of the right arm to flexion extension about the elbow. A goniometer recorded the elbow angle, and subject flexed the arms so elbow angle was 90 degrees. The sinusoidal disturbance torque was applied about the elbow joint by a connected spring, and the end of the spring connected to an oscillating cantilever arm on a sinusoidal stretching machine. The independent variable was the level of voluntary contractions, and the dependent variable was the force disturbance in EMG of the biceps. Findings. The TSR transmission increased with contraction levels, and the rate of increase varied from frequency to frequency. The absence of peaks and gain curves led to a smaller phase advancement of EMG response ahead of the stretch. So in conclusion, the TSR was active even during low levels of contraction and seemed independent of voluntary control exerted by patients. In spastic patients, a lack of correlation was observed between voluntary and reflex contraction of a muscle. Therefore, the reflexes don't support purposeful movements, but rather compete with them. Failure of contraction supports the concept that the change of gain in normal subjects is caused in part by supraspinal control of long loop pathways. For our second paper, it was labeled Increased Shortening Reaction in Parkinson's Disease, Reflecting a Difficulty in Modulating Long Loop Reflexes. The purpose of the test was to see whether long latency reflexes in standing subjects and shortening reactions classically tested while sitting or laying supine were identical in both normal patients and those with Parkinson's. The tasks. The subject stood on a tilting platform to evoke long latency EMG response of the anterior tibial muscle, and the shortening reaction was measured when the subject sat with a flexed knee. The independent variable was the conditions of the subject, whether they were sitting or standing, and the dependent variable was the EMG of the triceps surae and anterior tibial muscles. Findings. The sudden tilt of platform resulted in a short latency response of the triceps surae. The long latency response in tibialis anterior had an average latency of 135 milliseconds, and latencies were slightly longer in patients with Parkinson's. The latency of long loop was significantly shorter than the fastest voluntary action elicited by the somatosensory stimulation, and latency of a voluntary action shortened considerably during training, whereas latency of the long loop remained constant at repeated testing. So in conclusion, standing is associated with a higher level of the basic activity in the tibialis anterior, which altered the responsiveness of motor neurons to long loop reflex input, while sitting was associated with relaxation of postural musculature in normal patients. Parkinson's patients couldn't modify the postural tonus due to functional demands and couldn't control the long loop response in the tibialis anterior under different conditions. So EMG patterns in standing and sitting patients with Parkinson's disease were similar, which indicated that the long loop and the stretch reflex are of the same origin. So applications for individuals, for patients who dealt with who deal with the disorder and the nerves are affected, such as Parkinson's, or those who are spastic. Reflexes and responses are generally more difficult for them to grasp than those for normal people. However, that reflexes aren't generally one-sided and can be applicable to everyone. Tasks. I used two examples. The short loop reflexes, which can act as a defensive movement, they are natural response to everyone that can include tasks such as taking your hand away from the stove or preventing something from getting in your eye, and these trigger reactions are applicable to everyone, but triggered reactions require practice and in a certain period of time, so they are more based towards those who practice them in general via repetition, and they will find themselves more likely to induce these reactions. And with the environment, the responses will be different for those whose condition prevents them from reacting in a timely manner. Because they are more latency based, response types are dependent upon latency time and of their state, and the environment does play a big role in the types of responses activated, such that there's a greater likelihood of perturbations in a forest than there will be at a grocery store. And this concludes the end of my presentation.